Hi everyone and welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at how to create these raindrop effects. And I mean, it's super simple. It's not really a very complicated material. We've got some rain speed in here, and I've also put in some procedurality with the water. But we're primarily dealing with the business end of it, which is these concentric circles. Okay, so here we are in the graph, and it's actually two graphs. I've got the concentric circles getting built in this one and then putting it together as water in a separate graph. But we're going to start here. And as you can probably guess from the frame titles, that waves are involved here. And I've got two different kinds of waves. I'm using a sine and a cosine. And then we're running it in two different directions. And you'll see why in a minute. But before we do that, it's a lot easier if we might as well just build this first. So this is the actual shape that I'm going to be running through it. And we're going to start by building this ring. And then we're going to start talking about waves as we go through it. So I'm going to come in here, File, New Substance, and we'll call this Raindrops. Oh, did I make that empty? That's fine. It'll be empty. It's only going to pump out masks. And we can save this, and we'll save it as raindrops. And we now need to build our ring. So I'm going to come into my library, and I'm going to get a shape. And we're going to want two of these. So I'm going to do Control D and duplicate it. And the first one I want is a Gaussian. And then for this other one, I used a thorn. I mean, you can use whatever shapes you want, but that's what I used. And we'll grab a couple of levels nodes. And I'm also going to need an invert grayscale and a blend. So I'm going to put this in my mask because I'm going to cut, I'm basically cutting a hole out of this shape. And now we're going to tweak it to where we like it. And I'm going to tweak it using those levels nodes. So I'm going to start with my exterior first. Actually, I do want to look at this one. So I'm going to single click back on that levels. Yeah, I probably do want that very fuzzy on the outside. Now I'm going to single click on this one, and this is going to deal with that hole in the middle. Maybe something like that. You can always come back to it. Well, we've got this ring now, and that's the thing that we're going to be plugging into our various effects maps. And let's get an effects map. We'll change that to grayscale. Let's plug this in here. I'm going to right click, edit effects map. I'm going to double click on my quadrant. We're going to keep it like this. We're not going to add any more because we're going to just be making a single shape. And I realized I want to also make these so that they don't tile. So I'm going to come into tiling mode, absolute, no tiling, and the same with this one. So I'm going to do input image, and now we see this image here. And this is, if you don't, the way effects maps work is each time you put a quadrant, it's going to, quadratize, whatever that word is, each quadrant every time you go down. If you just want a single image, you can just do it on this route. We are going to want an iterate node though. So let's do that, and then we'll switch the route here. Actually, no, we don't need an iterate node. We're going to need an iterate node later. I'm going to bring this back down. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing here. To get our concentric rings, we need to have it start super small and then get bigger and then do it again and do it again and do it again. If we use a straight up timeline, it's just going to do it the one time. It's just going to start super small and then it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger forever and ever and ever. And that's not going to work. So if you want something to repeat, you need to use a wave. And we've done this before to drive animations. Thing is, if we've got, let's pretend this is the number 1. So this is our wave, and it's going up to 1, down through 0 to -1, back up again over and over and over again. We've got, it's hitting the same number twice, essentially is what it's doing. So we have to figure out a way of using this wave and then only using the first part of it as it gets bigger, and then not paying attention to it as it's doing this other stuff and getting smaller, and then only pay attention to it again as it gets bigger. And we can do that, and we will do that. So but I just wanted to show you conceptually what it is that we're trying to achieve here, because for me anyway, it's easier to sort of see it like this and kind of visualize it. So let's get back to substance, and we would normally get our wave out here and our constant 1, and we have our amplitude and our frequency. And again, if we go back to our little picture here, our amplitude is how far up it goes, so this point here and that point here. Right now it's 1. And then our frequency is, the bigger the frequency, the shorter, the closer these things get together. There is, however, one more factor that we have to think about when we're doing animations, and it's a key one, which is time. Now, up until now, simply because of the way that this works, this wave function right here works on straight up $time. You can't change how quickly that time passes with this node. But one of the things that we're going to need to do is, because we're staggering our raindrops, we can't have them all running off the same timer. It's going to create gaps in our animation because, they're all hitting 0, for example, at the same time. So you can dress it up to a certain extent, but I mean, you can kind of, if you look for it, you can kind of still see it in here. But by staggering them, you got to change their time, basically, is what you got to do. And so we have to reinvent this node, essentially. If I want to use it for what I want to use it for, I got to make a new one. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to open this reference, and this is actually opening this up and showing me in read-only how that node is built. So I can copy this and make a new one, which is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to copy the whole thing. We don't need this part. That part that's this greater than 0. To be honest with you, I've never quite figured out what goes on with that. I just use an absolute because that seems to work better. So I'm not even going to copy that. I'm just going to copy this part. So I'm going to do Control C. I'm going to come into my Explorer. I'm going to go into my raindrops. I'm going to right click, New Substance Function. I'm going to click on my graph, and I'm going to Control V and paste that in here. And now I can fool around with it. It's no longer locked up, and I can actually create the custom function that I need. I'm going to call this, I don't want to give it the same name, and it's giving me this error message because there's no output node set, and we'll set that in. Now, it's still not quite right because it's looking for input parameters, but it doesn't have any. So we have to make some. It's got no inputs in here. So we need to sort that out, and that's because they may be in here, but we actually have to add them in because we just copied it. We have to make it match. So it has to be case sensitive. I normally do these. I like to start them with a small case. So I'm going to change these later. I'm going to change these rather than change the way I'm building my parameters, simply because otherwise I just get confused. And we'll make another one for frequency. And then I'm going to have to come back in here and change that so the cases match. But what I can also do is make a third input parameter and call it, I don't know, time shift. Let's call it time multiplier. And again, that's going to be a float 1. Now notice how we can't set in minimums and maximums here because these are all going to be inputs. And I can now add a couple of nodes. and replace regular time with my new and improved time, which will allow me to slow it down or speed it up as I need it. And now if I come back to my regular graph and get back into my effects map, that those things are now reflected here. So we can just start using this guy instead. And if we wanted to run just like the other one, we just plug in one into all of those things. So if we got one plugged in here, it works exactly like the wave that you find in the library. So that, that's a quick and dirty way of making yourself custom-made nodes. You just copy what they have and just add or subtract from it. And let's go back right now and make another one of these for our cosine. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing, and I'm going to come back into Raindrops, new substance function, paste this. We'll call this cosine wave, and we'll get a cosine. Just switch that guy out, copy that, come back into our cosine, and paste that in. So we now have essentially two, they're the same thing, it's just one is dealing with a cosine wave, the other one's dealing with a sine wave. And let's come back to our raindrops. Oh, you know what we still need to do? We need to make an input parameter in here. I bet you it'll still paste that input in here. Yep, so I'm going to get rid of that float 1. But I'm going to change these guys now. So I want my default to be 1. If we have minimum 0, we'll let it, we do want it to go down below 1. So I'll leave the minimum as 0. Let's make the maximum, you don't really want to go more than 2. Once it starts going really fast, it gets weird, because I was fooling around with it. But when I staggered them all below 1, because it just seems to work better that way. But fool around with it. Yeah, so that'll work. And we can come back to our color luminosity, and now we can get that variable. And we can put that into our time slot. Okay, so now we have to figure out how to make this do what we want it to do. So our sine wave is starting at 0 and it's going up and down through 1 and into -1 and then up into 1. And I don't need the negatives. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get an absolute. So it's now just going to be in the positive the whole time. And the other thing I need to do is convert this to a float too, because we're talking about offsets right now. We're going to be making it, oh sorry, not offset. We're talking about size, but it's a float too. It's got an x and a y. So I'm going to take whatever this number is and I'm going to vector it into a float too. So it's going to do it evenly. And if we look at this now, let's just finish this up. Let's look at this before we go any further. We're going to need a sequence. Oh, well, we're going to need that later. I was actually looking for a sequencer. And we'll finish off with the number 1 because that's what the luminosity wants, and we're going to set this as the output node. I'm going to create an output node here because we didn't do the template. And I'm going to call this mask 1 because we're going to be making more. And we're going to call its usage mask. I'm going to right click, view outputs in 3D view. Let's just change this for now to base color is fine. And let's publish this out to the player. And if we turn on our timeline, nothing happens. Yeah, I just realized we didn't finish our function here. We did this, we didn't actually set our variable. So let's come in here, set, and we'll call this size, and then we'll plug this in there, and then we got to come back out to our effects node, and we're going to come into our pattern size, empty function, and we want to get that float 2, and we're going to write it in here. And we're going to set that as our output node. So let's see what that looks like in the player. And there it goes. And it's going out and back in a wave, which is exactly what we told it to do. But the thing is that we only want that first half. We don't want the second half going back. We don't want to see that. We just want to see the front end. And we can fix that. So we have to set up a conditional statement. So our wave starts at 0, and then it gets bigger, and then it gets smaller, and then, but because, you know, we're doing absolute, so it's getting bigger, getting smaller, getting bigger, getting smaller. I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to set up another wave, only this time I'm going to make it go twice as fast. So we're going to put that in the frequency. And what it's doing is it's squishing this wave in. So this is going through its cycle twice for every time this one goes through once. And that means if I get this wave is greater than or equal to 0, oh, I don't have a 0 here yet. I'm going to have to get one of those. If this is greater than or equal to 0, then I want to see what's going on here. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. It does weirdness when you do that. Okay, I want to see this. That's going to be our size out at the end. Otherwise, I don't want to see anything at all. And we're talking about float 2's here. So I can either add a constant float 2, or I can duplicate this and make one like that. Doesn't really matter. It accomplishes the same thing. So it's either showing us what's going on in this wave here, or it's got nothing. And that's going to be our size. So let's take a look at that again. So it's going out, and then it's disappearing. It's going out, and it's disappearing. And it's working. I mean, it's, you know, it's not very pretty, but it's doing what it's supposed to do. It's just shutting it down on the flip side. So it's, as it's going backwards, it's just making it disappear. So that's the first bit done. But now we have to figure out how to get rid of that, you know, nasty cutoff. And again, we're going to use the power of waves. I'm going to plug this in here, just like that. And it's kind of really hard to demo without, for the moment, I'm just going to put this in here. And we can just go ahead and put a function on this opacity that's going to, you know, get rid of that sharp cutoff. You know, because as the, you know, again, this, you know, if it's a wave, it's cycling between 0 and 1. So we can easily do that. Let's make an empty function here. And I'm going to grab that sine wave that we made and a couple of constants. And, you know, it's basically the same principle. We're cutting the wave in half. So I want my frequency to be 2. My amplitude is 1. And we don't want it to go into the negative numbers, so we're going to get that absolute. And we're also going to get our time variable. So it syncs up. I mean, they all have to be synced up together. They all have to be on the same timeline. So these two guys, let's put that back in there. These are a pair. So you got to use the same time variable for each one of these. Let's see what that looks like. There it goes. So it's just fading it out at the end because they're both dealing with that first half. So as this is getting ready to click out, it's just getting faded out by the blend. Okay, so that's one of them. Now you'll notice that we're only using half of our wave. We've got this giant piece of dead space here. I mean, nothing's happening. And we could have it happening. We just have to do what we're doing here. We just, instead of going instead of watching it get smaller, we just need to see it get bigger again from 0, and that's just a question of reversing it. I'm going to make a frame around these, and we'll call this sine, because that's using our sine wave. Eventually, we're going to have them all come out in separate outputs, but right now, just so we can watch them in the viewer, I'm going to start blending them in here with lighten blends for testing purposes. So I'm going to get one of those in there. And this is close enough that I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this, and then we'll adjust it as needed. So I'm going to right click, edit effects map, and we're going to come into the copy and we're going to change things around. Okay, so we just need to pretty much just reverse everything. Let's start with reversing the direction of our wave. We've got, well, time multiplier has nothing to do with anything. We're going to add in a subtraction here. And we've done this before. We've like reversed sliders like this. So I'm going to do 1 minus whatever's coming out of here, because it's a positive number between 0 and 1. So it's just like reversing a slider. And then I'm going to turn that into a float too. And then I also want to change the point in time where this is happening, or point in space-time, I should say. We want to get, what were we using here? Greater than or equal to, we want to get the opposite of that. We want to get a lower equal. So we want it happening in the opposite part of that wave, in that empty spot. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. And then let's look at this opacity. Yeah, you know, I just looked at my notes, and for some reason I have this one different, and I fooled around with it a lot. So at this point I don't remember why I had it different, but it's the only one where I have this set as 1. I'm tempted to see why. Let's leave this alone, and let's combine these two things together, and let's see if this works. Yeah, I don't know why I had it set as 1. I was having trouble with some of them cutting off early. I think I was just fooling around with it. Let's leave it exactly the same for now, because logic would demand that they would be the same. That's why I'm wondering why I put a 1 in there. All right. So now it's using up both halves of that wave. So it's using the positive and the negative space. Okay. So that is our reverse sine. And now we get to do the same thing with the cosine. So again, let's duplicate this and duplicate that. We're going to need one of those. And let's edit our effects map. And now instead of our sine wave, let's get our cosine wave in here. Oh, we forgot to do something with this wave. We forgot to take care of these two guys. We put in time multiplier, we didn't put in the other two. Let's come into our sine wave. So I'm going to copy that and paste. There we go. Okay, now it's got all the right bits. Let's put that in there. Let's put this in here, and let's put our time multiplier in there. Now, we're going to leave the sine wave in here. We're going to change this direction, but even though this one is going to be moving on a cosine wave, so instead of starting at 0, it's starting at 1 and then going down, as opposed to starting at 0 and going up. That's essentially the difference here. But the frequency is the same, so it's kind of it's staggered, but it's still working on the same timing. And we want it to be on the same timing as the other one. So we're going to keep the sine wave timing. We're just going to run this cosine wave through it rather than a sine wave through it. But because of that, we need to change this direction of when it happens. Because in the same point in time where the sine wave says 0, this says 1. So it's like exactly opposite. So that's why we're doing that. Okay. Let's test that again, make sure it works as we're building them out. Oh, yeah, no, we'll leave them exactly that. There we go. Because the timing's different, so it's like starting at a different point. All right, we're getting there, we're getting there. And one more, we'll do the reverse cosine. Okay, let's try. Did we connect them? No, we didn't connect them. Let's do that again. There we go. One of them is maybe should flip it. Seeing a bit of a feedback on that one. One of those rings was going backwards, and that's because it was doing it in the wrong half. So that's how you can think of it. This is like turning it on and off, like depending on which half of the wave you're in. And then this is the actual action that you're looking at. So those are our concentric circles. But what's happening is, like, if we sent this out just like this, and we went and we put it in another material and we put it in an effects map, all of these, no matter how many times, no matter how many random iterations you have, different sizes, whatnot, they're all going to be pulsing at exactly the same speed, on, off, etc. So since we've already got the function going on in here, it makes sense to send each one of these out, like do this again. So in other words, do this exact same thing that we did here with our rings, to do them with each one of these concentric images. That probably made no sense at all. Let me just do it. I'm copying just the FX maps because we're not using. What did I just do here? That's a blend, so I want this. Let me just make sure that that is the correct effects map. Yeah, okay. This basically what these effects maps do here is they stagger whatever you're putting in here. They're putting in, each one is going in a slightly different wave. So in this round here, we've created the actual concentric rings. I see what I copied here. I grabbed up one of these guys' mistake. Okay, we can get that blend. I need another blend in here. So we're going to blend these guys together. And then we are going to blend this back into here. Now, what I did was I added another one in here along with a transform 2D, just to give it a bit of richness I'm taking, again, it's just easier to see this if I do it like this. I want to take this image, whatever's coming out of here, and I just kind of want to give it a bit of a, sort of like a bit of noise. So I'm holding down Shift and Alt, and I'm going to get this slightly smaller. Oh, it's because I'm doing that. Okay. And I want to kind of create a little bit of a bounce to it, noise-wise. So bring this way down. I had this really down, so it's kind of creating a little sort of extra bit of noise for the because that's all this it really is. They're noise wave. Well, they're fluid waves, but function's the same. So maybe like that. I just thought it gave it a bit more bumpiness in a nice way. And then we take each one of these. Where did I plug that in? I plugged it in here. Yeah, okay. So each one of these is going to be our concentric circles. I mean, it's just pumping out the one. And now I'm going to make 4 different versions of them that are staggered in the same way that we made the rings themselves. It's probably a lot easier to explain as you're doing it. But we don't have to do any of this fade stuff because this is just the timing mechanism. And now, just to test it before we create all those output nodes, let's just duplicate this and get a couple of transform 2D nodes. And I'm putting the transforms in there so they're not all laying on top of each other, so we can actually see them. It's just easier to test it in here rather than dealing with 2 graphs, so I just want to make sure it's running before we start into the other graph. Yeah, so they're not all happening at the same time. Now we're still getting a fair amount of dead space in here, but that's where the time multiplier is going to come in later. But we're getting, they're starting to be staggered a little bit, which is what we're going for. Right, so instead of having them blended in here, let's go ahead and make some more of these guys. Now I'm going to turn this back into a mask, and then I'm going to duplicate it. And we can just get rid of all that stuff. No, I didn't. Wait a minute. Mask 1. I'm going to call that mask 2. Okay. So I'm going to save that, and let's go ahead and make a new substance, which we're going to use for our puddle water. We'll call it puddle water, and this time we'll do the PBR template. That's new. This is a new version. I guess it puts colors in there for you. I don't need any of that stuff. Okay. So the first thing we want to do is to bring in our raindrops. And if we look at it, it's got our time multiplier in here. And we're going to be able to we're actually going to bring in 3 of these. And we're going to have each one of these on a slightly different timer. But we're going to be doing exactly the same thing to them, so let's just work on the one, and then we'll apply it to all of them. So we're going to need another effects map because we've got our basic, concentric ring here. Now we have to do something with it. In order to make my life easier, again, because this is on a timer and it's like a set on 0, so all we're seeing is the black, I'm going to come back into my raindrops, and I'm going to copy this thing. And I'm just going to plunk it up here, and I'm going to put a frame around it, and we can call this tester. And it's going to give me exactly the right color, and because this is the thing that's getting spat out of there, so it's just best to test with that. So let's come back to our effects map, I'm going to switch this to grayscale. And for now, we're going to use this as our image. So right click, edit effects map, and we are now going to set up our effects map. So I've got my first quadrant highlighted. I'm going to hit the space key, and I'm going to get myself a few more quadrants. And then for this last row, I'm not going to have any of these highlighted. I'm going to hit the space bar again. And I'm just going to put a quadrant out there. And we're going to make 3 more copies of this, but we're just going to work on this first one. And then we'll copy it out. It's a lot easier. And then the final thing that we want to do here is we want to add an iterate node. And we're going to turn that into our root. So let's come back to our last quadrant. And we're going to set the pattern to input image. And you can kind of see our little rings there now. And let's come into this quadrant and let's get into our color and luminosity and create an empty function. And now we can start building our offset and our size. So we're going to have the offset on a slight animation, because I don't want them appearing in exactly the same spot every time they come up, but we don't want them moving so fast that they actually look like they're moving. So we're going to want our time function, but we're also going to want to slow it down. And the number that I came up with was 0.02. And we'll multiply time by 0.02, and this will be the timer for this, for this setup here. We're going to need some random nodes. I'm saving one for later. And if I put them in like this, it'll start the offset from 0, because this starts at 0. 0 times any number is 0. And that means that it will start off on exactly this grid if we leave it like this. And I don't want that. I don't want my animation to start on a grid. They're raindrops. So we're going to have to move it along a little bit before it starts. Now, as far as the function itself goes, this doesn't make any difference at all. All I'm going to do is add the number 1 to it, and that means it's just going to start on the number 1 position instead of the 0 position. And then I'm going to send it to my random. So instead of starting at 0, it starts at 1. Now our offset is a float 2, so we're going to have to vector this, and then we'll set our variable, and we'll call it offset. And I'm going to copy this. I'm going to come back out here, and let's get into our pattern offset. We'll create an empty function, and we will get our float2 variable and name it and set it as our output node. Next, we want to do our size. Now, I want my size to be round. I want them to be round. I don't want them to get like weird shapes. So, it's always going to be the same. X and Y is always going to be the same number, but I don't want it to be the number 1. I actually want them to have more of a range. I want them to be bigger. So I'm going to have a random number between 0 and 3 as my sort of base for the size. But I also don't want them really small. So we're going to kind of set a floor. And we're going to need an if-else statement. And let's get a less than. So if whatever this number is less than 1, then I want you to take that number and add the number 1 to it. If it's bigger than 1, then just go ahead and use the number. And so what this does effectively is it means that you're getting a number somewhere between 1 and 3, not 0 and 3. And just like the other one now, we're going to vector this to a float2 and then set our size variable. Going to find size in here, empty function, and bring our float2 in. And now we're just going to hook them all up. So we'll get a couple sequence nodes. And first we'll sequence these two guys together. And then we will finally end it with the number 1, which is going to take care of our luminosity and set that as the output node. And now we have our little rings spread out all over the way we want them. I mean, that's our placeholder, but that's the only way we can see them right now. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, we're not going to need the AO. That's what's screwing that up. We don't need a metallic. And the rest of these we're going to use. I'm going to right click, view outputs in 3D view, and that fixed our ambient occlusion problem. So let's replace this with what's coming out of our previous graph. And we'll just put it into the color for now. And let's publish it out. Yeah, you can kind of see them. There you go. And they're disappearing again. Because remember, that's only one of those waves. We have 4 waves. So it's only dealing with 1/4 of the time frame that it takes for a wave to go from 0 back to 0 again. But it's working. So let's come back into our effects map and let's make some copies of this. So I'm going to make 3 duplicates. And we'll put 1 in each quadrant. And the only difference is that we changed the image that it uses. So we go down to the index here, and oh, we have to plug them in first. Hold on a second. Yeah, because as you plug them in, it's going to make new ones. Now let's go back there, and we'll use 1, 2, and 3. And let's see what it does now, because we staggered them in here, right? So it's better. I mean, it's not using 1/4 of it. It's using all 4 quarters, but you can tell where those, you can tell where the borders of those quarters are because they're all fading kind of in and out at the same time. And it's just, there's no more dead space. So we're slowly moving towards what we needed to do. Let's come back here. And this is now where that time multiplier comes in. Because, actually, I'm going to get rid of these. And I'm going to duplicate this twice. And if we laid these all on top of each other the way it is now, it's just going to be less gray. But we might, let's hook them up. So we'll get a blend, we'll use a lighten, and we'll merge all of these things together. And if we look at it now, it's going to, at least theoretically, give us, just exactly what we were looking at before, only piled up on top of each other. So we're going to see more of it. Yeah, they're just brighter. So there's a couple of things we need to do here. We need to make them as different as we possibly can. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and make sure that each one of these has a different random seed. And the next thing we're going to do is make sure that they have different time multipliers. So I'm going to bring this, and I'm looking for weird numbers. I'm looking for like oddball, not quarters, not halves, because that's what we're doing in here. We're trying to make that messy. We're actually trying to get it to be messy. So maybe like that. You know what? I'm gonna do what I had in my notes. I had in my notes 0.71, 0.59, and 0.91. Might as well stick with what I got. These are, you can use whatever numbers you want. I came about with these numbers because I just fooled around until I found something I liked. And hopefully this will get rid of some of that, those spaces in between. Like, you see how it's going off. So let's try that. That's better. There's never a time when there's absolutely nothing on here. Well, except for that one time. That's close enough for the purposes of this lesson. I'm going to leave it alone. You can fool around with these timings. That's how I get them. I just messed around with them. And the way I messed around with them is you can create temporary input parameters. So I had TM1, time multiplier 1, TM2, and TM3, and each one of them I exposed in here. And what that let me do then is to fool around with it in here. So you can actually fool around with the timings while you're watching them in the player. And it took me a while until I was, until I found something I was happy with. So I'm not going to do it again here because it's a waste of everybody's time. But that's how I came up with those numbers rather than, going back and forth, publishing out, looking. It's just easier sometimes to make temporary input parameters that you can just get stuff right. And then once you find those numbers that you like, you just plug them in. All right, so let's turn this into a material now that we've got the basics done. And one of the things that I added in here, and we might as well make the input parameters now. I want to be able to change the speed of my rain. So I made an input for that. And I had my minimum as 1. And I had my maximum as 5. And then, yeah, let's just make all of them now because they're all kind of connected. I had a water speed and a water direction. Sorry, I had a water speed and a wave's height. And our water speed is an XY, so that's going to be a float too, because we're going to want to be able to move it in different directions. And we're going to set our default as 0. And I'm going to have my, I don't know, whatever you want. I'll have my maximum as 2. Oh, that's it's okay. We're going to have our minimum will be 0 and let's make our minimum -2 and then we'll make our maximum 2. So we can move it in 2 different directions. And we can make our labels speed X and speed Y. And finally, we're going to have our wave height. I can group these last 2 in as water. And our wave height we can just have using the defaults. That's fine. It's going to be a super simple water. It's just something to put it on top of. Okay, let's get a height to normal. And I'm going to get clouds too. And I'm going to get a blur. I'm going to lower these clouds down. I'm going to make it smaller. And then we'll make this parent size. And let's get a blend. And I'm going to actually copy that height to normal. So this first one is going to be our little raindrops. Again, I'm going to plug, let's make a copy of this so we can see what we're doing. And we can plug that into our normal. And we're going to make a normal for our water. Well, I'm just going to use these clouds for our water. But I want to be able to adjust my wave height. So in this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into our height depth here. And I like the default. And the default is 16. So I'm going to keep things super simple. I'm going to get the variable we just made. And I'm going to multiply it by 16. So it won't go any higher than this, but it'll go lower. And then the other thing I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to affect these guys a little bit by what's going on underneath it. As they're floating up and down on the water, our little rings. So I'm going to get a warp. And I'm going to take our little rings and I'm going to warp them by what's going on underneath by a very little bit. I had like 0.31 in my notes. I mean, that's a lot. I think it's set like that's 1, so I want them to be round. Yeah, it's about right. So somewhere in there. So they're round, but they're they're being affected by what's going on around them. I mean, they not by much, but I think it makes a difference. They look less mechanical. And then we're going to have to move all of this stuff. So let's get a transform 2D and let's come in here and put in our offset. Now, we can't just put it, I mean, we have to do something. We have to put time on here because we want our water to move. So let's get our $time. And we are talking about a float 2. So we're going to need to vector this into a float 2. And our water speed is already a float 2. And all we need to do is multiply the 2. And we're going to need a second one of these for our height. So I'm just going to keep that down there. So we got our normals. And yeah, let's just take care of our height now. I'm going to get a levels node. And we're going to darken this up because we want this under our little rings. And let's get a blend node. And again, I'm going to use this as my template. And I'm going to use a lighten blend here. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust my water to where I can see my little rings. That's probably right. So like the highest bits will get a little bit of height on them as well. And then this, we want it to move along with the normals. I mean, we don't have to add this to the roughness. I'm just going to do it to be symmetrical, but we're not going to do anything at all to the, I mean, we need it glassy, but we're not going to touch it as far as anything else goes. Actually, let's get another one for our color, which we're going to add now. So we're going to use the same cloudy thing, and let's get a gradient map. And I'm going to pick two very, very similar colors. So probably something like that. And actually, let's blend those two before we put them in here. So I'm going to want my rings. We'll use a lighten blend again. And we're going to put it on top of these clouds again. I'm going to just put a levels node in there so we can adjust the color. Okay, now it'll plug in because it needs a grayscale. So we're getting an ever so slightly different color in here. You can adjust, I think, maybe a little bit more contrast. Now, fool around with it like you like, but I just want to kind of pump it up a little bit. And let's plug that back in there. That should be our color. Oh, still want to run it through the transform. There we go. Let's take a look. Yeah. Almost there. But so far so good. We can move our water and the droplets are moving along with it. And we can, hold on a second. That wave height isn't working. There's something wrong there. This is completely flat. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so I think I have a pretty good idea about our water problem. I believe we forgot to take care of our disorder here. So let's come in here, make an empty function. And time by itself is going to be too fast. I know this because I've tested it out. And I'm going to multiply it by 0.1. And we'll set that as the output. So we have one more thing left to do here, and that is to take care of our rain speed. I want to handle it in a couple of different ways. First of all, I want to actually physically speed up the drops. But what I also want to do is as they get faster, I want them to have more iterations. So we're gonna put something on the iterate in here as well. But let's start with the easy one. Now we set in our time multipliers in here, and we want to keep that difference between each one of these. Well, they're not really materials, they're, you know, the previous graph. We want that differential. I mean, that's what makes this work. So what we're actually going to have to do is remember this number, and we're going to multiply it by our rain speed. So this first one was 0.71, and we need to get our variable, and we're going to multiply the two of them. So I'm going to actually just copy this, and then we're going to come back and change the other ones. So this is 0.59, and this one is 0.91. So that's just taking the time multiplier and multiplying it by our rain speed. So it's just going to speed them up by whatever fraction we've got in the rain speed. Next, we want to do something for our iterations. And what did we have our maximum set in here? We had it set in at 3. So let's do it at half of that. So I'm going to come in here, edit effects map, and we're going to set up an empty function on our iterations. Let's get our variable, because we know we're going to need that. And you'll notice that we need to have an integer here as our expected output. So we're going to need to get a couple of those too. And we're going to toggle between 1 and 2. So the iterations are either going to be 1 for the slower rain, and then as it speeds up, I want there to be more rain. So we'll get an if-else and a less than. Actually, let's do a less than or equal. And then I'm going to pick a constant where I want this shift to happen between 1 iteration and 2 iterations. And I'm going to pick the halfway point. I believe initially when I was doing this video, I had a 5, and there was a computer malfunction. And I ended up having to reshoot some of this video, and I decided on 3. So if we initially did this as 5 for our maximum on the rain speed, after fooling around with it, I decided it was 3. It really doesn't matter. It's what you want it to be. But I just chose whatever that number is. When we're through the halfway point is when I want to switch. But that's all we're doing here. We're taking that conditional statement and we're providing the iterate node with the integer it wants, depending on where that rain speed is. And now we actually have to apply this to our other effects map. So I'm just going to copy this, and let's go in and change these guys too. Okay, let's see what it looks like. Okay, so the water's working. The rain speed is speeding up. And then as it passed through 1.5, we actually ended up with more drops. So it doubles the amount of drops. And then, I mean, we kind of already checked this with the non-wavy water. So this all works. And our wave height is also working, because now it's gotten back down to being completely flat. So I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, because you know, as it goes faster, it just gets kind of weird. There's a point where it stops looking good, so I think even two might be a better number. But anyway, that's the methodology. I mean, you can fine tune it. It's just a question of getting all these things together and tweaking them up in here. So I'm going to call that done. And I hope that's been helpful. And I will see you guys in the next video.